welcome. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and I pay respect to the elders past and present, and to those Aboriginal people who are with us today. And the place that we meet today, for many of us, is with the traditional owners are the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, but I appreciate there's many coming to us today from other areas, so I acknowledge those other traditional owners as well. So as we reach the end of this season of Djerrin, the days are getting colder and we can see more rainy days as we move into Makuru, and our lakes and waterways are starting to fill and starting to see flocks of ravens in the sky, I think. Certainly around my place I'm seeing that. Look, thank you very much everyone for joining us today. National Sorry Day remembers and acknowledges the mistreatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were forcibly removed from their families and communities, which we now know as the stolen generations. Today at Wanslea, we commemorate National Sorry Day with the opportunity to hear stories from members of the stolen generations. Wanslea has been an institution in this community since 1943, and our intention was always to assist families experiencing a crisis. But we can learn so much about the right way to work and about how to truly care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families if we acknowledge the truth and the past and we listen to these stories. So with the greatest respect and love for our First Nations people, children and families and community who have been hurt and for whom the impact is felt through each generation, let me say sorry for the wrongs of the past and commit to the right and respectful care and support of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, families and communities. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Robin Collard, Elder, and our GM, our General Manager of Cultural Safety and Partnerships. And I'm so thrilled to have Robin with us and part of the leadership team at Wanslea. I'm going to hand over to you now, Robin, to take us through today's event.
Thank you, Leanne. I would like to also acknowledge that we are here in Noongar country and also include Wangatha country within this webinar. The first guest that I'm going to introduce is Christine Ross, who is an Arrernte Kaditj woman, desert woman, who was born in Alice Springs and has grown up in Darwin. She moved to Perth in 2002. Christine comes from a very large Aboriginal family who are scattered throughout the Northern Territory and Western Australia. Christine's career began as a teacher in the education department, where she studied also in South Australia, and then spent several years in the Northern Territory. And I might add, Christine was one of my first bosses in the education department. So thank you, Christine, for that start in life. Christine went on to become the General Manager of the Central Australian Aboriginal Media Association, also known as CAMA, in Alice Springs. And she worked there for a number of years, and she also oversaw the largest festival that is held in Alice Springs at the time, which is the Yeparenya Festival. Christine then moved to Perth and has worked at Murdoch University, also the WA Department of Education, and she has been working in the resource sector for a number of years. She has organised many key events, also for us here at Wanslea last year, the Yorgas Yanan Yira event that we had at Burswood on the Swan last year. She's also been chairperson and a key leader for different Aboriginal organisations and events across Australia. We are so very, very thankful that Christine is here to share her story. And I would also like to say, this is a very touching time for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is Sorry Day. For us, we have to share our story. We relive the traumas of the past, but it's also a chance for us to look toward the future and heal. Kaya, Christine, Wanju, hello and welcome to share your story with us at Wanslea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robin. And Warda, everybody, in my language, which is Kaya in Noongar. And I wish to, before I start, acknowledge the Whadjuk people on whose beautiful country I've been fortunate to have lived on for the last 20 years. Thank you, Robin and Wanslea, for inviting me to be a speaker here today on a day that personally means so much, and of course is slightly emotional, as I'm a descendant of the stolen generation survivor. So today I look forward to sharing my mum's story with you, but also my story. And I will just need to refer to my notes just to make sure I've covered off everything. As Robin mentioned, I was born in Alice Springs and my family moved to Darwin when I was about 4 years of age. So it meant I lived away from country, from my aunts, uncles, huge extended family, including my grandparents. Both of my parents are Aboriginal. They were both born in Alice Springs, but sadly my mother was stolen from her family at the age of 6, and it's her story that I will tell today. She was taken along with 5 other girls under the age of 10, and they were told that they were just taking them shopping in Alice Springs. But sadly, they didn't return from that shopping trip till 53 years later. So in about the year 2000, those 6 women obviously went back to that exact spot where they were removed from. It was an incredibly emotional day, and I was fortunate to be with them at the time. And they were remembering everything about that day, which is quite incredible because they would have all been in their 70s. So it brought back a lot of painful memories, but also good memories, like before they were taken and they remembered sitting in the creek, and they're all Eastern Aranda women, so singing the songs, their language, their stories, their culture. And the best thing was their family from down there had welcomed them back, because sometimes that's not always the case with our mob when they're reconnecting with family. So I'm going to zip through a couple of things. And I was asked, what does Sorry Day mean to me? And sometimes I might get a little bit emotional because it is a very sensitive topic. So we'll just see how we go. I stop and reflect on my mum and all my Garden Point aunts and uncles who were forcibly removed from their families at different ages. They grew up on a very remote island called Garden Point, which is Melville Island, the Tiwi Islands in the top end. And they were raised by priests and nuns from the Catholic Church. Now, they were deliberately taken to the top end because remember, these were little desert kids. And the reason for that was so families wouldn't come and take them back. So when they loaded them up in October, they were all put on the back of a ute. And if any of you know the top end, wet season, stinking hot. So that's how they travelled to Darwin. And of course, they'd never seen things like the ocean, so it was a bit of a shock to them. So sadly, it wasn't always an idyllic life growing up due to the strictness of the people of the cloth, and many were subjected to every form of abuse that affected them for the rest of their life. Despite what happened to them, they are the most incredible, amazing, humble, and at times forgiving people, but they never forgot what happened to them. I mean, the love and respect they have for each other, because at the end of the day, they had to raise each other and they became family for one another. And given that I grew up away from Alice Springs, where my biological family was, many of them became my family, and aunts and uncles, and Robin's in-laws, the Riolis, I refer to as my aunt and uncle. Some of them were my blood relations, as I found out later in life, but most weren't. But how incredibly blessed I was in my life to have grown up with these amazing people, given what their circumstances were in life. I do want to mention that in Bringing Them Home report in 1997, the focus was on a number of recommendations, but two of them was that there had to be an apology by the Commonwealth Government to members of the stolen generation. And we saw this took place in 2008 when Kevin Rudd issued the apology. So it took 11 years from the time that report came out to becoming a reality. And then the other recommendation in there was that the Garden Point people and all members of the stolen generation had to be compensated for what had happened to them. Because as history shows, it was actually the worst policy ever inflicted on Aboriginal people in this country. But they had to wait 24 years, I'm talking about the Garden Point mob, to finally be compensated. And sadly, during that time, over half of them passed away. So in November 2021, and that's, just a few months ago, the Commonwealth Government and the Catholic Church finally apologised to my mother and the Garden Point people for failing in their duty of care and their treatment of Aboriginal kids when they lived on that mission in Garden Point. In the lead up to that apology, I guess for me personally as a descendant, apart from supporting my mother emotionally, and I use the position I have, I suppose, as an influencer to make sure that the rest of the world knew this is what happened to the stolen generation. So I'd use LinkedIn or Facebook and I would share the personal story of my mother and her journey. So I put it into context for the wider Australia to realise that this is our history and this is what happened to my mum and the Garden Point mob. So to get compensation, I have to say it was a horrible experience. For 3 years, the Garden Point mob had to relive what happened to them numerous times. They were interviewed, they were assessed by a psychologist. It was terrible. And I remember thinking, why are they putting them, why do they have to jump through so many hoops to explain their story and give evidence? And when we talk about intergenerational trauma, I had to write up my mother's notes and tell her story from a 6-year-old about when she was removed and what had happened to her. And I tell you what, for me, it was really hearing sometimes for the first time the really sad, tragic details of how she was mistreated when she was in that mission. And I look at my youngest grandson, he is 6, and I simply can't imagine how you would take a child from a family based on the colour of their skin to assimilate them. So we lived in tragic times, unfortunately. So reading my mother's story or writing it, I just wanted to pick her up as a 6-year-old, and you just wanted to wrap your arms around her and stop her from having to go through what I know she did. And I have to say, and it's still emotional, I'd never cried so much over that 2 years of writing her story. And that's intergenerational trauma, and that's very real. One of the important things was the federal government brought in that all members of the stolen generation in the Northern Territory will receive compensation, because at the end of the day, many still haven't. So I was interviewed by Warren Snowden's officer, who was a member of Parliament, about Mum's story, and it was read out in Parliament House, and that helped get that passage of the bill passed so that all the stolen gen can now get compensation. And it was really important then for me to share that with Mum, that her story has changed the lives of other stolen generation people. I'm fortunate I go home to the Territory a lot. In June 2021, I organised a barbecue in Darwin to thank the volunteers who'd worked so hard on the compensation claim. We brought together the elders, but also importantly the descendants, so not just myself, but all the others, because we're so proud of our elders. We love them so much and we're incredibly supportive of them. And the Garden Point mob, and I talk about the elders and myself, our generation, my grandchildren, we will be forever connected. And I remember back in 2018, we had the NAIDOC theme at that time was "Because of Her We Can." And I will never forget sitting at the table with my mother. And she said to me one day, she said, "Who is her?" And I said, "You are her. Because of you, I can do everything that I do now." So it was a very emotional moment. And most importantly, we held a conference that year in Sydney where we had 700 women come to a conference to celebrate our Aboriginal women. Because I look at Mum, I look at all the women, the aunts, the grandmothers. Our women are incredibly strong, resilient. I celebrated my mother to the world during that conference. She sat in the front row every day while that conference was on because she was incredibly proud. So stories like that are really important because we always need to remember what they did, how they survived, and their influence on us. We take for granted being mothers, but they grew up without mothers. And it's for all the mothers that are still waiting for their kids to come home. So just some other quick things before I finish my talk. I've been asked to share stories and experiences growing up as an Aboriginal woman in Australia. For me, probably it was a good thing growing up in Darwin because Darwin's incredibly multicultural and I had a fairly good childhood and racism wasn't as bad or noticeable there. As a proud Aboriginal woman, some of the racism that I have incurred, and I can talk to as a fairly savvy, achieved a lot in my career and life, but we all get hit with racism sooner or later. And I think sometimes when you're an Aboriginal person, particularly a woman, and you speak out in support of your people, there are those that just can't quite handle that. So I've got to my age now where I'm turning the big 60 next year, and I think, well, I'm smart, savvy. I know what I need to say for my mob, and I'll call out bad behaviour when I hear it. But mostly it's focusing on the positive things for our people. There's still, I think Australia, we love our country. As Aboriginal people, we are the first Australians. We love our country more than anything. But we also need to know it's an incredibly racist country. And we're never, ever going to get rid of racism. I wish we could wave the magic wand, but we'll never get rid of it. And sometimes it's what you know as overt, covert racism. Yeah, it'll always be with us. But how we keep going in life, and there've been times when I've been absolutely gutted from people who've wanted to bring me down. If they see success, then we've got to kind of be put in our place. And sometimes that's not just Wodjila people, it can be our own people, it can be brothers. The tall poppy black syndrome is definitely alive and well. But I keep going because I think of my ancestors, who fought much tougher for us and hard life for us to be able to enjoy what we do today. And of course, for the future generation, my grandchildren's better future. So what would I like you to take away from today is always remember diversity. My mother always said, what we need to happen is Australia needs to know that the stolen generation happened. It is part of Australia's history and that it needs to be acknowledged in schools, taught in schools. I deliver a program called Ways of Working with Aboriginal People to the broader mainstream. And it's amazing to me how many people still don't know about the stolen generation, yet it's a big part of our history. So just to start to finish off on, how do we stop discrimination and bias? We need allies. So all of you that are tuning in today, a small portion are Aboriginal employees, but a greater portion are non-Aboriginal people. And for us to fight for recognition as First Australians, and we saw with the new government that took power last Saturday, there's renewed hope for us. There's a positive change on the way, but we also have to be realistic. There's a lot of work to be done. A couple of years ago, when we had the Black Lives Matter rally here in Perth, I looked around at thousands and thousands of non-Aboriginal people who stood with us down by the Derbyl Yerrigan. And I thought, that is amazing. That's the support we need. We only have about less than 800,000 people, Aboriginal people in Australia. So we are simply 3% of the population. So we need you to come on and start to call out racism when you hear it. Stand with us when we have our rallies and events, but also celebrate with us in our culture. So if there is a referendum to vote for a voice to Parliament, then we would really appreciate your support, because it's been a long time coming and it should happen in our generation. And, you know, when I talk about racism in Australia, until somebody is held accountable for the 500 Aboriginal deaths in custody, it's really hard for us to move forward. And we're tired of having to prove ourselves all the time. But the positive out of it is we're incredibly proud of our culture, its richness. We celebrate our songs, our languages, our art, food, families and land. Our families are sacred to us, so is our country. We come from the oldest living culture in the world, and that should always be celebrated. So thank you for listening to my story, and I look forward to listening to Lynette's. Thank you, Robin.
Wow. Christine, thank you so much. That is truly a story from the heart. And I must say, I too shed a tear for my mother-in-law and father-in-law who had gone through that process and passed just before the compensation, etc., came through. It is still no completion of that process for them or our families. So we've all been touched by stolen generation, the policies and legislation of the past, and we all hurt. Thank you so much, Christine. I'm just wondering if it's possible, if anybody has any questions to you, because I am conscious that you may leave towards the end. And, you know, when we share a part of ourselves, we are opening up that hurt again. So you just don't know how strong that you are. Because of you, we can hear this story, not only of you, but also of your beautiful mother. And it's an amazing story, and how the Garden Point people do connect together and became family because of all of the traumas that they were going through at the time, and they are still very strong connections to this day. So thank you. I'm not sure if anybody would like to pose a question to Christine whilst we have her online. No questions coming through? All right, thank you, Christine. If you'd like to join the group in the conference room, that would be fantastic. All right. I would just like to now introduce you to Lynette Sandy. Lynette is a Noongar Yuwit woman who grew up on the Mora Reserve with her grandmother, mother, uncles and brother. She completed her Bachelor of Applied Science at Curtin University. And again, I have known the wonderful Lynette for many years. I was one of her very first teachers at TAFE, where we first met. So Lynette has been working with the Wanslea Early Childhood Approach program as a community capacity building officer. She is just transitioning into a new role. For many, many years, Lynette was also an employee at Australia Post, and very honoured through that, through those many years of working there. She is proudly committed to the Aboriginal community and non-Indigenous community, as clearly demonstrated by her services as a board member for several organisations, including Yorgum, of which she is a founding member, Ma Murich, Murich Gullingar Association and Street Friends. One of Lynette's goals is to take what she has learned and use it to build a stronger, more independent community service, which provides culturally appropriate services at grassroots and community level. Kaya Wanju Lynette, Murit Yoga. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Chris, for that story. It was very emotional for me. My mother, my grandmother and my great-grandmother were all part of that stolen generation. And now, what does Sorry Day mean to me? I never really thought about what Sorry Day meant to me until I heard the former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, present the apology to Indigenous Australians as a motion to be voted on by the House, which included the lines, "We apologise for the laws and policies of successive Parliament and government that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these our fellow Australians. These policies did have an effect on my family, from my great-grandparents, grandparents, mother, aunties and uncles. These policies, the 1901 Act and the 1905 Act, have done what it has done to them. It's about acknowledging the past, and this did happen right across Australia to Aboriginal and Torres Strait families. I think that's admitting that there was something, and I think that's a really powerful thing that Mr. Rudd said that day, and it became powerful because I didn't realise how it affected my family. Growing up in as an Aboriginal in Australia, well, it was very hush-hush, very secretive. We had to keep things quiet. I grew up in a country town in Mora, living on the reserve with my grandmother, mother, uncles and brothers. We lived in a 2-bedroom tin shed, and people will now pay hundreds of dollars to live in those little tin sheds. I'm just getting a bit nervous here. We lived in a 2-bedroom tin sheds and a small kitchen that we shared. We didn't have toilets or anything. We had an ablution block where everyone used it. Laundry, toilets and showering, and we used to chop wood to set the heater up to do our washing. They were really beautiful days and beautiful memories growing up in there, and we never even thought about racism. We didn't realise the difference. What discrimination, hardships and traumas have I faced as a direct result? And I say again, not knowing that we were discriminated against was a normal part of my life, until I heard about the late Charles Perkins and the Freedom Ride in New South Wales. When I heard that, I was around 12 years old, about his adventures, I could say. And when he was talking about what happened in the New South Wales, I was thinking, oh, that's us. He's talking about us here in Mora, allowing kids to go to the swimming pool. We were segregated. We weren't allowed to go in this side of the pool or this side of the movies. And I can remember when I was and my grandmother was still alive, Slim Dusty came to town, and all the Aboriginals were one side at the back and all the whites were in the front. And that never even thought about being racist to me, because we were all together anyway. And Slim Dusty came out and I think when he came out to meet and greet all of us at the back, it was like that he came out and seen the blacks that were at the back. That was one of the most memorable memories of racism growing up. I found it very hard to identify as an Aboriginal person, as we had to be secretive. We had different ways of talking around white people or the police, because the police were the main people that Aboriginals were frightened of. They were the ones that came and took our kids away. My grandmother had a very dislike for white men and the police, and she just accepted our fathers when they came to visit, and then it was like there were stories and files that were kept on our families. And what kept us going in the face of adversity, we kept our family going, was the love of my grandmother. She and my mother worked for the local doctor, and my mother worked as a cleaner in the White Ladies Lounge in the local hotel in Mora. My grandmother would clean, but was not allowed. My mother would clean at the hotel, but wasn't allowed to enter the premises to socialise with the ladies. There was a coloured bar for both men and women. This bar was operating until the mid-70s and into the late 80s in the northwest of Western Australia. And the funny thing about that, in the 70s there, they used to have the Aboriginal men playing darts, and it was the white men that said, if they can't drink in here, we're not going to play darts for this club hotel, because when they played their darts and they wanted to wait, they had to go back into the coloured bar before they can come back into the white bar. So that was very much into the mid to late 70s and early 80s. And what would I like you to learn and take away from this? I would like people to know that this happened all over Australia, and there are files on all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. I have records about my grandparents and great-grandparents and grandmother. I have a copy of my auntie's application for citizenship rights so that she can work as a nurse. I have hoped that they have learned a little of our Aboriginal history, and that we need to all work together to move forward by acknowledging the past policies of the government is a healing in itself. And this does not help without moving forward and without people rallying to help us. It's about the policies, it's not about the people. And this is what we are sharing. And the policies, we've got records, and I've been reading my great-grandmother's record, and I've been crying and seeing how her youngest son was taken away from her and sent from another location to where she was, and asking permission for her 4-year-old son to be with her, and how she was separated from her daughters. It's emotional and I think sad at times, because I can remember when my mother, we had an argument, and she said, "You do not know what I have been through." And I am so humble at that woman and what stuff she had. She never talked about the stuff that she had been through. And I watched a show on SBS called Servants or Slaves. And when I seen that, I cried, because I could see the stories that my mother wasn't telling me, or she wasn't telling anyone, even my aunties and a lot of our family, female and men, the stories that were there that wasn't said. And what can we do to stop discrimination? We need to teach our children at home, daycare and schools. The earlier we teach our kids respect for others, there will be no bias. And that's all I need to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynette, for sharing your story. Do we have any questions from people watching to Lynette about her experiences, or or if there's a comment that we can make, we would really appreciate the questions. Lots of thanks coming through, Lynette, for sharing your story. Just to round off, these stories are the lived experiences of our guests today, of both Christine Ross and Lynette Sandy. Nidja Wankaning Court. They are the stories that they share from their heart, which is a beautiful gift to each and every one of you who are listening. Because of her, we can. And have a look at the incredible strength, the bravery, the courage that they have shared. And I'm sure that you too feel their story from the heart. Once we finish this webinar, it will be available for people to go back and look at it and the recording. And we just listen to this as we phase out. Thank you for joining us.
It's all about life and a love for the land. Looking out to the bay, sweet Belgium beer. Waking up to the sound of the jungle fire. It is paradise. It's where